Guillotine. Imagine standing in a crowded square in Paris in 1792. Above the crowd was a tall wooden structure. At its center was a heavy, angled blade, suspended above a small opening where the condemned person's neck would be secured. This was the guillotine. What makes its history especially strange is that it was not originally designed as a symbol of cruelty. During the French Revolution, physician and politician Joseph Ignace Guillotine argued that executions should be carried out by the same method regardless of a person's social class. At the time, beheading with a sword or axe could be slow and horribly unreliable. Guillotine believed a mechanical device could make the process faster and more consistent. The machine was developed by Antoine Louis, with Tobias Schmidt constructing the prototype. On April 25, 1792, Nicolas Jacques Pelletier, convicted of robbery and murder, became the first person executed by the new machine in revolutionary France. The execution itself was surprisingly quick. The condemned man was secured to the scaffold, the executioner released the blade, and, in an instant, it was over. But the crowd wasn't impressed. Some spectators actually complained that the new machine was too fast. They had expected more spectacle and apparently missed the drama of older executions. That changed rapidly. During the Reign of Terror, the guillotine became one of the most recognizable symbols of the French Revolution. Thousands of people were executed, including Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And the machine continued to be used long after the Revolution. The final execution by guillotine in France took place on September 10, 1977. Almost 2 centuries after its first use, the blade finally fell silent. France abolished capital punishment 4 years later, in 1981. Hanging. Few execution methods have existed in as many forms as hanging. Today, the word might suggest a single method. Historically, it could mean something very different depending on the country and period. In earlier forms of hanging, death could occur through strangulation rather than an immediate breaking of the neck. This meant that the condemned person might remain alive for considerably longer than people today often imagine. For serious crimes, particularly treason in England, hanging could become part of something much more elaborate. And that brings us to one of the most notorious punishments in English history: hanging, drawing, and quartering. A condemned traitor could be taken to the place of execution, where the punishment was carried out publicly. The sentence was designed not merely to kill. It was designed to humiliate, terrify, and make an example of the condemned. Thousands of people could gather to watch executions, turning punishment into a public spectacle. One of the most famous cases was Guy Fawkes, the man associated with the gunpowder plot of 1605. In January 1606, Fawkes was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered for high treason. But when his execution began, Fawkes managed to jump from the ladder and break his neck. He died before the full punishment could be carried out on him. Drawing and quartering. Now imagine an execution where death itself was only one part of the sentence. In medieval and early modern England, hanging, drawing, and quartering was associated with high treason. The punishment was deliberately public. The condemned could first be hanged, then taken down before death had completely occurred. The rest of the sentence involved mutilation of the body, and finally, division into quarters. The purpose was not simply execution. It was political theater. The message was directed at everyone watching. This is what happens when you challenge the state. One of the best documented examples is again Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot. Fawkes and his surviving conspirators were convicted of attempting to destroy Parliament and kill King James I. On January 30, 1606, the executions of the conspirators began. Fawkes was scheduled to suffer the full punishment the following day, but as he climbed toward the hanging platform, he jumped from the ladder. His neck broke, and he died immediately. Because he was already dead, the executioners did not carry out the punishment in the same way they otherwise would have. The story is important because it reveals something about historical executions that is often forgotten. They were not always performed exactly the same way every time. Breaking on the wheel. Few punishments became as infamous as breaking on the wheel. It was used in parts of Europe for centuries, although the exact procedure varied considerably by place and period. The basic idea was brutally simple. The condemned person was restrained against a large wooden wheel or placed upon a wheel-like structure. The executioner then used a heavy weapon to break the bones of the body. In some versions, the victim's limbs were attacked first. In others, the chest and other parts of the body were targeted. The purpose was to cause catastrophic injuries while sometimes deliberately delaying death. Historical accounts describe cases in which the victim was subsequently displayed on the wheel, sometimes for hours or even longer, as a warning to others. And this is where the punishment became more than an execution. The wheel itself became part of the message. The condemned body could remain visible to travelers and townspeople, transforming the punishment into a permanent warning. The practice was especially associated with serious crimes and was used in various parts of continental Europe, but there was no single universal version. Some victims died relatively quickly, others survived for much longer. That uncertainty made the punishment even more terrifying. Burning at the stake. Burning at the stake fire has been used as a method of execution in many societies, but in medieval and early modern Europe, burning at the stake became particularly associated with heresy and certain other crimes. The reality was more complicated than the popular image. Not everyone sentenced to death by fire was necessarily burned alive. In some cases, the condemned person was strangled or otherwise killed before the flames consumed the body. But there were also cases in which people were deliberately left alive as the fire began. One of the most famous was Joan of Arc. In 1431, Joan was captured during the 100 Years' War and tried by an ecclesiastical court. She was condemned for heresy. On May 30th, 1431, at Rouen, the 19-year-old Joan was burned at the stake. Her death did not end her story. Decades later, a retrial examined the circumstances of her condemnation, and Joan's reputation gradually transformed. The woman who had been executed as a heretic eventually became one of France's most famous historical figures. And there is another important misconception. The famous Salem witch trials in Massachusetts are often associated with burning witches, but none of the 20 people executed during the Salem trials was burned at the stake. 19 were hanged, while Giles Corey was pressed to death after refusing to enter a plea. The burning at the stake tradition was much more strongly associated with parts of Europe. Beheading. Long before the guillotine, there was simply the sword. Beheading was one of the oldest recorded methods of execution and was used by civilizations including the Greeks and Romans. But it carried a strange social distinction. In some societies, beheading could be considered a more honorable death, particularly for members of the nobility or military. The Romans, for example, used decapitation as a form of capital punishment, and swords were regarded as an appropriate instrument for certain citizens. But there was a major problem. A human being with a sword is not a machine. One executioner could make a clean strike, another could fail. The condemned person might move, the blade might be poorly positioned, or the executioner might simply lack the necessary skill. This is one reason mechanical methods such as the guillotine became attractive centuries later. The goal was to remove human error. But the basic principle remained exactly the same. One movement, one blade, one irreversible moment. Crucifixion. Now we go much further back in history. Long before medieval Europe, ancient civilizations used execution methods designed not only to kill, but to display the condemned person publicly. Crucifixion became particularly associated with the Roman Empire. The victim was attached to a wooden structure and left exposed. Death could take a considerable amount of time. That was part of the punishment. The condemned person was not simply removed from society. Their suffering was placed directly in front of society. The Romans used crucifixion particularly for slaves, rebels, and others considered outside the protections given to Roman citizens. One of the most famous mass crucifixions occurred after the Third Servile War. In 71 BCE, after Spartacus's rebellion was defeated, thousands of captured rebels were crucified along the road from Capua to Rome. The road itself became a warning. Anyone traveling toward Rome could see what rebellion against Roman power meant. Crucifixion was therefore both execution and propaganda. The body of the condemned person became the message. Impalement. Few punishments were as strongly associated with terror as impalement. One of the earliest major bodies of evidence comes from the ancient Assyrian world. The Assyrians used extreme violence as part of warfare and political intimidation. At the ancient city of Lachish, Assyrian reliefs depict prisoners being impaled. These were not simply private executions. They were displays intended to terrorize populations and discourage resistance. The images were carved into stone and placed in an imperial palace. Think about what that means. The Assyrian king wasn't merely recording a battle. He was recording the punishment of his enemies. The relief became a permanent statement of power. Resist the empire, and this could be your fate. Centuries later, impalement continued to appear in different regions and under different rulers. The methods varied, but the objective remained remarkably similar: terror through public punishment. Boiling alive. In 16th century England, an extraordinarily unusual execution method briefly became part of the law: death by boiling. In 1531, during the reign of Henry VIII, Parliament passed a law making poisoning a form of treason and prescribing boiling to death as the punishment. One of the most famous cases involved Richard Roos, a cook accused of poisoning food connected with the household of the Bishop of Rochester. Roos was condemned and publicly executed at Smithfield. Historical sources describe him being boiled to death. The punishment did not last for centuries, however. The law was repealed in 1547 under Edward VI. So, although boiling alive sounds like something from a fictional horror story, it really did appear in English law. Execution by elephant. Finally, one of the strangest execution methods in history came from South and Southeast Asia: execution by elephant. For centuries, some rulers in parts of India and Southeast Asia used trained elephants in public executions. The elephant could be ordered to crush a condemned person, and historical accounts describe other uses as well. The reason was not simply that elephants were powerful animals, they represented something much larger: the absolute power of the ruler. An elephant could be controlled by its handler, meaning the ruler could demonstrate that even an enormous and terrifying animal was under human command. Historical accounts describe the practice in India under different rulers and periods, including the Mughal era. One particularly striking feature was the public nature of these executions. People were sometimes brought together to witness them. The execution was, therefore, a warning. The condemned person was turned into an example. And perhaps that is what makes the history of executions so disturbing. The real purpose was often not just the death of one person. It was making sure everyone watching would remember it. Thanks for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating stories from history.